Maaike. So I will talk about agroforestry today. So my name is Danae Roosendaal. I work in two groups here in Wageningen, in the Center for Crop Systems Analysis and in the Plant Production Systems group. And I work there on perennial crops, so ecophysiology of mostly cocoa and coffee, and agroforestry in a more broader sense. And today I will give you a bit of an introduction to agroforestry. Okay, so what will we do? So first an introduction, as I said, then talking a bit about tree-crop interactions. So I've heard more about crop-crop interactions, but now it will be tree-crop interactions. Then going towards yield, so comparing yield between agroforestry and monoculture. Effects on resource levels of agroforestry, so having trees in the system as a next point. And then more generally from, well, what do abiotic conditions do in modifying effects of trees and crops together? And also to end with some remarks beyond yield on ecosystem services. Okay, so what is agroforestry actually? So in the broad sense, the broad definition is from, well, it's a contraction of the terms agriculture and forestry. It's a land use that combines aspects of both, including the agricultural use of trees. Now, that is a very broad definition, but what we usually use is the definition of Meijner van Noordwijk, a bit of the agroforestry guru, and he usually says trees on farm. So this trees on farms, that's agroforestry. And then if you look at this scheme, so here you see a triangle of livestock, trees, and crops. Now you have different ways of combining these elements. And indeed, everything that includes crops, includes trees and some agricultural elements, so either livestock or trees, can be called an agroforestry system. But today we will focus on a small subset of those systems. And one example, for example, of an agroforestry system often used in the tropics is alley cropping. And what they do there is that they grow crops. This is Sumatra in an experiment there. So they grow crops in between rows of trees, and those trees are often legumes. And they are basically pruned, so to keep them quite small, so to minimize competition for light in the system. But they add the prunings in between the rows to the crops to actually improve nitrogen cycling there. And this looks, you might say it might look kind of the same, but this is a more European type system in which rows of trees are used, often walnut trees combined with, for example, cereals. And if you keep the strips of the crop quite wide, you can even manage to harvest the crops mechanically without any problem. And these are the systems that I am more working in, so shaded systems in the tropics. So they can look, very variable. It can be one crop mixed with one species of trees. But what often happens is that you have, for example, cocoa or coffee and a lot of different tree species around it. So more shaded systems. Now, if we then talk about the tree-crop interaction, so I mentioned a couple of interactions already that you can have in between trees. So what Cannell put forward as a hypothesis is from, well, if you combine trees and crops in a system, that system is only beneficial if trees are actually able to acquire resources that are otherwise not available to the crop. Now, there are certain ways in which trees could be able to do that. So think, for example, about nitrogen fixers. So in that sense, extra nitrogen is added to the system. But also by taking up water and nutrients from deeper soil layers, trees can actually increase the resource availability to crops. But of course, there's not only those benefits of trees in cropping systems, but they also compete with crops for nitrogen or water, for nutrients and water. So the net interaction effect is basically the balance of those two. So the benefit of having the the trees there. So they call it often fertilization effect and the competition effect. Because there are those negative interactions as well. This is maybe a bit too simple to say from, well, it's only about resources and competitions, but there are a lot of other effects at stake. So you indeed have the beneficial effects of trees, but then also competition for light, and that's often quite strong, water and nutrients as well. But then you have additional effects that trees can have on the microclimate, on the crops below them, effects on pests, disease, and weeds. I won't go into detail here, but it can go in many different directions. For some pests or diseases, it's beneficial to have an agroforestry system. For others, because of the higher humidity, it's absolutely not. Effects of soil conservation. So often trees are actually used to decrease the effect of erosion, and possible allelopathic effects can go in multiple directions. But if we then look at the outcome of all those interactions between trees, so what does that actually mean for yields? So if you compare agroforestry systems with monocultures. So maybe one thing to mention first is from, well, we do not know that much yet. So we have like a lot of scattered studies in different systems that compare yields, but not large scale systematic studies. So a lot of the evidence that I will show today comes from literature reviews, actually, and meta-analyses. But this is one study that I wanted to start with. So this is a study that compares, that looks at intercropping between walnut trees and wheat and barley. And typically, so if you compare, so in the white bars here, you see the monocrop yields, the grain yield, so not taking trees into account. The green bars are the saleable arable systems. And then you typically see that, at least here, so in the later years, that the grain yields go down in agroforestry because of competition. But if we then switch to a totally different system, so here we look at, so I will show some results of a meta-analysis that was done for sub-Saharan Africa in a quite dry area in total. So very different systems were included here. So think about more diverse home gardens as agroforestry systems. Here you see intercropping with maize and bean, I think, and mango trees. Here, annual crops between trees. Here you see more the alley cropping type system. So basically, they compared all those types of systems and evaluated the yields between monoculture and agroforestry systems. So if you then, for these systems in relatively dry areas, so if you look just at yield, you see actually that the crop yields are higher on average in agroforestry systems than in monocultures. But that is for crop yields in sub-Saharan Africa. And so please don't try to read this, but if we look to a similar study on coffee yields, now this is also a meta-analysis for coffee plots in Latin America. So they looked at the whole range of variables, but if you then look at coffee yield, then you see more the typical expectation. If you just look at crop yield, then yields are typically lower. And this is for systems that have more shade in them, so higher density or shade cover of tree species. But for systems that had not that many trees in them, they did not find a yield difference. And then a similar meta-analysis was done for cocoa. And you see that if you then compare, so the same is done here, so here you have monocultures, here agroforestry, and you see if you look at cocoa yields in agroforestry systems, that it's slightly lower than in monocultures. So based on the studies that were published in 2020. But if you look at total system yield, so if you take a yield from tree species, for example, fruit trees that are included also into account, then we actually see that yields can be higher. But when they compared the economic performance between monoculture and agroforestry, they did not find a difference. So that were yields. So we do see actually very different effects. But what does that mean for, but what is under that? So what actually causes those higher or lower yields? So are there effects on resource levels and resource use efficiency? So I wanted to show one example for resource use efficiency, one of the few studies that looked into that. Actually, Wopke and Jochem are involved. It's an example from Apricot Agroforestry in China. And they actually looked at cumulative light interception in those systems and the above ground dry matter production. And then if you looked at the intercropped one, so that are the open circles here, you see that there's slightly more biomass produced per light interception. So light is more, so the resource is more efficiently used by combining crops and trees. But for most of the systems that I'm aware of, such effects have like detailed measurements on resource use have not been done. But what they often look at is seeing from, well, do the total amounts of soil nutrients change in the systems? Is there an effect on, for example, water levels like soil moisture or other soil characteristics like the soil infiltration rate? And then for the drier systems in Africa, where we just looked at, we see indeed from, well, there is an increase in nitrogen and phosphorus and soil organic carbon, and that is probably because of the trees adding more nutrients into the system through nutrient cycling and maybe also uptake from deeper soil layers. And that was also an effect on soil moisture and the infiltration rate. And soil moisture maybe because there is microclimate buffering by the shade trees and less evaporation in that sense. And is there indeed increased nutrient cycling as well? So one of our former PhD students, Rika, looked at this for cocoa agroforestry systems in Indonesia. And she compared 3 different types of litter. So basically from a forest species, Vacrea fragrans, so tree species, from cocoa, just the leaves, and a mixture of cocoa and Gliricidia. Gliricidia is a legume that is often used as a shade tree in cocoa systems. And what she then saw is from, well, the decomposition rate of cocoa is, well, not that high, but if you mix it with Gliricidia leaves that are very high in nitrogen, actually the decomposition rates increase and nitrogen levels can increase in the system. So often in those systems, nitrogen fixers are used. And here then the broader picture for meta-analysis in cocoa in this case. So they looked at also at effects of agroforestry at nutrient availability in the systems, and actually looking at the broader picture, comparing many studies together, they did not find much evidence, no evidence at all, actually. So we often say from, well, it is very beneficial, but the evidence is not completely there. And then looking at soil physical properties, they actually found, higher water content in monoculture. Yes. Oh. Is this going?
Okay. That's me.
Okay, it's Wopke. Good. No panic. Hope that's going well. Okay, so actually higher water content in monoculture. So this could actually be an indication for competition. And I think, no, not going to, we'll get back to that later. So it might not always be the case. So in that sense, like even by doing a meta-analysis, it does not mean that the evidence or like answers to the questions all go in one direction. Good. Then the next part. So what are actually effects of abiotic conditions? And with that I mean, so what is the effect of having areas different in rainfall, for example, or soil fertility? Because the question, of course, is from, well, is agroforestry beneficial? And if so, yes. And under what conditions? How and where? So how should you design a system? Does it only work in drier areas and wetter areas? In general, the hypothesis there is from, well, if you have drier, warmer conditions, microclimate buffering by agroforestry systems can be very beneficial if there is no strong competition for water, of course, with crops. And then from, well, this potential is often recognized, so it might be it might be a way to get to more climate resilient systems, but there is very little empirical evidence available for this yet. This, for example, is a study that was done in cocoa agroforestry systems, where they looked at a range in shade tree cover, and then they compared monocultures and agroforestry systems in their microclimate, basically. And then indeed, you see in agroforestry systems that there's a lower temperature on average, there's a tendency towards a higher humidity, and that for soil moisture from, well, you see indeed that with higher shade cover, you get like an increased competition for water, because you get lower soil moisture in agroforestry systems. And here, of course, in another experiment, they evaluated that from, well, is there indeed competition for water between cocoa and shade trees? And what they did is that they compared 3 different cocoa systems, so a full sun monoculture basically, and 2 different agroforestry systems in which cocoa was mixed with one other tree species, Albizia and Antiaris. And then they looked at the combined transpiration rates, so basically water use in those 3 systems. And then we see indeed that from, well, if you look over the different seasons, so wet season, dry season, and then a very dry season followed and a wet season again, then you see that the transpiration rate, so when trees are present in the system, is actually higher than at the cocoa system alone. So in that sense, it might mean from, well, there is probably competition for water. And this study was actually, this is one of the few done, was actually shown from, well, you see, agroforestry is not useful, and it generated a lot of discussion. But do we then have some evidence of variation in rainfall between different areas? Now, this is so far also only mostly coming from meta-analyses and modeling analyses. And what they here did, this is the same meta-analysis on coffee. I mean, they actually looked from, well, is that difference between agroforestry and monoculture? Well, how does that vary with the annual rainfall? So here they plotted coffee yield against the annual rainfall. And the red line is a monoculture, and the other lines are agroforestry systems, the blue ones with the highest shade. And then you actually see that consistently over the entire rainfall gradient. It seems that the high shade level has the lowest yield. There's no strong evidence for a positive effect of microclimate buffering by agroforestry systems. And well, this is some earlier work, also volcano, and this is so not on cocoa and coffee, but this is basically done along a rainfall gradient in Nigeria, and they looked at sorghum, and they mixed that with tropical trees. And what they show here is in the dotted line is like this is the line for the single crop, so the monoculture. And I looked at total production, so it's net primary production, and it includes both the trees and the crop. So then you see from, well, if you have more trees from production, total production becomes higher. But the point is that the grain yield, so if you look only at sorghum yield, that was overall, so across the whole gradient, still lower than lower in agroforestry systems, so in the mixed system, than in the single crop system in the monoculture. So here also no evidence. And I would like to show one more study, and so this one is on coffee, and we're working on similar analyses for cocoa at the moment. So basically, they worked with a simple crop growth model for coffee, and effects of shade trees are included. So basically just the amount of leaves that are shading the coffee trees in this case. So their leaf area index, and then an extinction coefficient. And what they did is that they simulated coffee growth at 3 different altitudes, around 1,000 meter, 1,500 meter, and 1,800 meter. And then they compared also agroforestry systems and monoculture systems in terms of yield. And then also here on the x-axis, this is the amount of shade cover that you have in the system. So if we then look at basically the lower altitude system, and they looked at different climatic scenarios as well, current conditions and future conditions, then you see from if you have more shade on in the system, you see indeed that there is basically a positive effect, or expected to be a positive effect of agroforestry with relatively higher yields with more shade cover. And on the mid-level altitudes, that effect is under climate change, so harsher conditions than now, that is still there. But at higher altitudes, where conditions are anyhow cooler, then you see that there is a negative effect of trees on coffee yield. Basically, also under climate change. So it is a simulation study, of course. But this study indicates that we indeed could expect there might be a positive effect of microclimate buffering by trees, but only under certain conditions. Okay, so one piece to end with actually, so beyond yield. So far we have only talked about yield in agroforestry systems, but there is of course also a strong positive effect on ecosystem services. And this is not debated from we know there's a lot more carbon storage above ground, a lot higher biodiversity in these systems. So in many cases, they're also seen as another way to increase resilience of agroforestry systems. And one other study that Rika did, for example, is to see compared also 3 different systems here on coffee agroforestry. So she looked at simple agroforestry systems, complex agroforestry systems, and annual crops. And what she then tried to see from how resilient are those to disturbance. So she looked at effects of a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. And then she tried to assess through farmer interviews how fast do those different systems actually recover? And then she looked both at farming system recovery, so that is basically, is the yield level earlier reached again? And she looked at income recovery. And then she found that indeed in more diverse systems, or say in agroforestry systems, recovery was faster because there was less damage done to the soil, and agricultural production was back to levels before faster again. Okay, I think I'm quite quick, or not?
Yeah, so that's very good. So we have
quicker than I thought. Maybe I went too fast. But maybe some take-home messages and points to further discuss, because the answers are not always clear-cut. So what did we talk about? So the crop yields are typically higher in agroforestry than in monocultures in sub-Saharan Africa, but lower in other types of agroforestry systems that we saw here, so like coffee, cocoa agroforestry systems and the more silvo arable systems. And indeed, the question here from well, that's probably as a result of the balance between facilitation and competition. In cocoa, we saw that there were higher total system yields in agroforestry systems than in monocultures. And for a lot of other studies, we do not know that. They're not always taken into account. And it depends, of course, on whether you have a very simple agroforestry system and what type of trees you have in there, whether there are trees with also crops that can be sold, also products that can be sold or not. And there's a need for more empirical, so for larger scale on-the-ground studies actually that evaluate the functioning of agroforestry systems, and together with model-based approaches, research on yields, particularly also resource use efficiency in agroforestry systems. And beyond yield, so agroforestry systems provide a higher level of ecosystem services than monocultures, and that means that it's sometimes also put forward, for example, in a totally different field, but in the forest restoration debate is to basically restore forest cover through having agroforestry in there. But there the debate is always from you get actually to the land sharing debate. From do you combine both crop production and ecosystem service provisioning in agroforestry systems? Or do you go towards monoculture versus forest and in a more land sparing approach? But we'll not go into that, I think.